Well, we're going to continue our journey through the land of Israel tonight. We may finish up a little bit early tonight, but we'll see how things go. I've given you a review sheet. And what I want to do is I want to go through the presentation. Then I have a video, if it works, an excellent video I just saw recently that deals with the legal right of Israel to exist as a nation today. You watched that, I think, didn't you? You may have. I think I posted a link to it on Facebook. Anyway, it's excellent. Now, we're familiar with the biblical right of Israel, and Israel has a right biblically, and that's enough for us. Mm-hmm. But according to international law, what is the legal reason why Israel should have a right to exist? So I want to try to show that video tonight, if we can. Our internet has been down for 2 days here at Shasta Bible College. We just got back this afternoon, about 3 o'clock. So hopefully that's all going well, and we'll be able to do that. But let's take a look at the review questions here, see where we're headed tonight. We're going to be talking about Nazareth. Of course, that's of interest to us. The birthplace of the Lord Jesus. Not the birthplace, but the birth announcement, I should say. And the home of Joseph, and maybe or maybe not the original birthplace of Mary. There's some dispute over where she actually came from, but she was married to Joseph and lived there in Nazareth. Talk about Megiddo. Correct pronunciation in Hebrew is Megiddo. You often hear it said, pronounced Megiddo, but it's Megiddo, and this relates to Armageddon. We'll talk about that tonight also. And then Jerusalem. So those three places, Nazareth and Megiddo, kind of more up towards the north, and then we're going to be working our way southward to Jerusalem. We're going to lay some of the groundwork about Jerusalem. So here are some questions. First of all, what valley lies below Nazareth to the south? Then Nazareth has existed since what period? So we want to see how long Nazareth has been around. Is it an old town? Was it a new town in biblical times? We'll talk about that. How many times is Nazareth referred to in the Old Testament? How large was the population of Nazareth in the time of Christ? What kind of reputation did Nazareth have in the time of Christ? Describe the population of Nazareth today. And what valley lies to the east of Megiddo? Approximately how many layers of civilization have been excavated at Megiddo? Some extra biblical records that mention Megiddo. So Megiddo is a place mentioned in the Bible, but also outside of the Bible in ancient texts. To what tribe was Megiddo allotted? What king of Judah was killed at Megiddo? And what about the etymology of the word Armageddon? What does that word actually mean? There are actually several theories. We'll talk about the most well-known and accepted theory, and maybe one or two other theories. Name the three valleys that are associated with Jerusalem. Discuss the location of Mount Zion. Notice this, at various stages in Jerusalem's history. What does that mean? Is Mount Zion a wandering mountain? Has it moved? Well, we'll talk about that. Number 16. Where is the Mount of Olives located in relation to Jerusalem? We encounter the Mount of Olives on numerous occasions in the Gospels. And so we want to know where that is in relationship to the city of Jerusalem. 17. What is the principal water source for the city of Jerusalem in biblical times, and where was it located? 18. How old are the old city walls that stand in Jerusalem today? You often hear reference to the old city walls, okay? And there are old city walls there. They are old. How old are they? We'll talk about that. Describe the location of the biblical city of Jerusalem in relation to the old city walls that stand in Jerusalem today. And then lastly, describe the location of the Temple Mount in relation to the old city walls that stand in Jerusalem today. So that should be all very interesting, and you'll want to remember as much of this as you can when we get to Israel, and especially to Jerusalem, because If you don't know where these things lie and where they were in biblical times, you can very quickly and very easily become confused. So we're going to pick up the story where we left off last time, which was right up around the Sea of Galilee. And we pick up with the city, a little village called Chorazin. Now, Chorazin is actually to the north of the Sea of Galilee. Remember we said that the Sea of Galilee is over 600 feet below sea level. If you go north now, you start traveling uphill. You go up into these mountains, you're headed towards Mount Hermon, the highest mountain in Israel. And the lay of the land changes drastically as you head north up here. You're entering into a volcanic region of Israel. And because of that, the building materials are quite different around Chorazin. Throughout most of Israel, the main primary building material is limestone. And there's, in Jerusalem, a particular type of limestone called, in fact, Jerusalem limestone. There's a city ordinance in Jerusalem that all buildings must be constructed of Jerusalem limestone. And so you'll see that when we get to Jerusalem, all these buildings start white, very, very bright, very white. And there's this kind of uniformity to the look. But up here we're looking at a dark gray kind of stone. This is basalt. Basalt is of volcanic origin. It's very, very hard as opposed to limestone, which is very soft. So if we're talking about Chorazin, notice on page 18 of your little booklet, this is Roman numeral number 11. It is identified with Kerazeh, 2.5 miles north of Capernaum. So Capernaum was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, was the headquarters of Jesus, and now we're heading north into the high country, first established in the 1st century BC. Well, that means that Chorazin was a fairly recent town in New Testament times, established in the 1st century. Chorazin is known to us for its reputation of rejecting the miracles of Jesus. Point number 3, one of 3 cities condemned by Christ in Matthew chapter 11 and Luke chapter 10, where Jesus said, "Woe unto you, Chorazin, and woe unto you, Bethsaida, and woe unto you, Capernaum." These 3 cities, all around the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, had seen the miracles that Jesus had performed and had not responded positively to the message of Jesus as the Messiah. And he said, in the day of judgment, more mercy will be shown to Sodom and Gomorrah than to you. Because if Sodom and Gomorrah had seen the miracles that have been performed in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. So what's left of Chorazin today? Just these ruins. But we can visit the ruins, we can see what is there. There's also a modern village of Chorazin outside of the ancient biblical city. And so there has been a recent city rebuilt, but the old city is here. It's in ruins. It's in a remarkable state of preservation. What you're looking at actually right here in this photograph is the synagogue at Chorazin. And the steps leading up, these are the original steps. Probably, very likely, the same steps to the synagogue that were there in the 1st century when Jesus was at this synagogue. Now, obviously, these dressed stones in the background, this is modern reconstruction, and they've incorporated some of the original stonework into this so that you get an idea of what it looked like. This is typical of archaeological reconstruction that's done throughout Israel. They make it real obvious what is new and what's original. But they try to build things up, not completely, but enough so that you can look at it and have an idea of what things would have looked like in biblical times, but also so that you can very easily distinguish between modern reconstruction versus old. Oftentimes you'll see in a wall a dark line drawn, and the line is drawn, everything below it is original, everything new is reconstruction, or above it is reconstruction. So, and this is our group from several years ago here at Chorazin, standing below these steps. Here's another view on the inside of the synagogue. And this is typical synagogue construction, a row of pillars coming down one side, a row of pillars coming down the other side that would support the roof. Men would be seated out here in the middle, and probably there would be an upper gallery where the women would be seated. Women and men did not sit together in the synagogue. One of the reasons for that is that a woman who's experiencing her menstrual cycle is unclean and does not have contact with men. So, who's on their menstrual cycle, who's not, they don't necessarily want to make that public knowledge, so all the women just sat together, and all the men sat together. This is quite odd to find in a synagogue. Here on a pillar in the synagogue is the head of Medusa, a figure from Greek mythology. And it seems odd that we would find Greek mythological figures in a Hebrew or Jewish synagogue. And yet this is not the only example of odd things found in Jewish synagogues around this period of time. From the 1st century BC on through about the 3rd, 4th century AD, and even later, we find, for example, a number of synagogues that have zodiac symbols in them. And these zodiacs are found in a number of synagogues. Many synagogues had these types of decorations, but most were defaced during stricter times of enforcement of Jewish laws. This one may have survived defacement because the synagogue was destroyed in an earthquake. So look back at your notes on page 18. That brings us to point number 4. It was in ruins by the 4th century. So Chorazin comes into existence in the 1st century BC, in ruins by the 4th century. So it's only in existence for a few centuries. It was rebuilt again in the late 5th, early 6th century, destroyed again in the 8th century. Does this sound like a city that might have come under the judgment of God for rejecting the miracles of Jesus? It does sound like it. Renewed again in the 13th century and occupied continuously until the 20th century. Okay, there's a 2nd century synagogue, of course, built on the foundation of the original synagogue, and so things like the steps, the original foundation, and so forth may well go back to the 1st century. The synagogue itself, at top of page 19, is a basilica shape, 3 hallways separated by 2 rows of pillars, which we saw in that one picture. 3 doorways. The central one is the largest, so a big doorway in the middle, one on either side. The basalt seat of Moses. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. First of all, Matthew chapter 23, verses 1, 2, and 3. If you have your Bibles, you might want to turn there for a moment. Matthew chapter 23. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them." So what is the seat of Moses referred to here? Well, this actually is at the synagogue in Capernaum, or not Capernaum, in Chorazin, and this is Moses' seat. The writing in Hebrew tells the dedication and who contributed the money to construct this. But there were 2 seats. There was a seat for Moses and a seat for Elijah in each synagogue. The seat for Moses was for the reading of the law. The seat of Elijah was for the reading from the prophets. So the law and the prophets, the traditional twofold division of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. Now later on, there was added a 3rd designation, that is the writings. Sometimes you read of the law, the prophets, and the writings. And we have that referred to in Luke chapter 24 in the account of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. First of all, it says that Jesus talked about everything that was written about him in the law and the prophets. Okay, the prophets, or the law and so law, prophets. No, the law and the prophets. And then a little bit later, it refers to the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Psalms standing at the head of the third division, known as the writings. So the Hebrew word for law is Torah. The Hebrew word for prophets is Nevi'im. And the Hebrew word for writings is Ketuvim. Ketuvim. So you take the T and the N and the K from Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and it makes an acronym. Tanakh. Tanakh. So the Jews refer to their Bible oftentimes as the Tanakh. And you'll hear that from time to time. Tanakh stands for the law, the prophets, the writings, the threefold division. So the law of the prophets, the earlier way of designating the Old Testament, then gives us the seat of Moses and the seat of Elijah. So this seat of Moses has been nicely preserved, very ancient, with the original Hebrew inscription still on it. And when we visit the synagogue there, if you'd like to sit in the seat of Moses like the Pharisees did, you can do that. Okay? And hopefully your deeds will match your words, unlike the Pharisees. We also find an amazing ancient structure which gives us a good insight about architecture in biblical times. And this house is known as the House of Arches. The entire thing is built out of stone, this basalt stone, this very dark gray stone, and it is in a remarkable state of preservation. Now there has been some reconstruction. In fact, near the top of this wall, you see this line here? Right below the second course coming down. Okay, everything below that line is original. So including this archway, this doorway, and then they added a couple of courses of stone on top to build it up to its original height. As you enter into the House of Arches, you see why it's called the House of Arches. Now remember that this is in an earthquake-prone region. And so you get an idea as to how solid and reliable this method of architecture is, of building these arches with a keyway in them. It's been holding up this heavy basalt stonework for 2 millennia. It's still standing. Now, in biblical times, this would have been roofed. It's not roofed today, but they would have taken large basalt stones and laid it across there and then covered over with thatch-like roof and mud and so forth. Probably a flat roof, not a pitched roof like we have. But this stonework is so amazing. You can go into this House of Arches on a very, very warm Israeli day, and it feels like somebody's got the air conditioner going. And on a very cold day, you can go in there and it's comfortable. During the day, the stones will soak up warmth from the sun and store that up and keep it nice and comfortable all night. During the day, it provides beautiful cooling from the heat of the sun, and it's quite nice. So this is the House of Arches. That's there at Chorazin. Okay, so as we come down now from Chorazin back towards the Sea of Galilee, if we were to go down the east side of the Sea of Galilee, not the west side, but the east side, we would be in the region of the Decapolis, the 10 cities, 10 Greek cities. Most of them lay on the east side of the Jordan, and remember that the Sea of Galilee is just a wide spot in the Jordan River. So on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis, there's one exception, and that was Bet Shean, which lay on the west side. But it was while Jesus was in this region of the Decapolis that he encounters this demon-possessed man. The demons of the Gadarenes, or the Gergesenes. And there was a legion of demons that were living in this man, and Jesus cast the demons out, and as the Bible records, they begged Jesus not to send them into the abyss, but rather, would you allow us to go, they asked, into this herd of swine, a herd of pigs. And Jesus allowed them to, and the pigs rushed headlong down the cliff into the Sea of Galilee and were drowned. If you were to go all the way around the Sea of Galilee, there's only one spot that really fits that description, so we're quite certain of the location of that event. And you're standing approximately where that would have happened, looking southwest above the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. On the horizon from left to right are Mount Gilboa, and that's this mountain right here, kind of getting lost in the mist here. Mount Gilboa was where Saul and Jonathan were slain by the Philistines. Mount Tabor, which is referred to in the battle of Deborah and Barak against against Sisera. And you remember the story of Jael when she drove the tent peg through Sisera's temple? That's a story everybody likes to remember. Okay, so Mount Tabor fits into this. Tradition holds it that Tabor was the Mount of Transfiguration. It probably was not. When we look at all the biblical data and evidence, the Mount of Transfiguration almost certainly took place on Mount Hermon, not on Mount Tabor. Nevertheless, there is on the top of Mount Tabor a monastery built in commemoration of the Mount of Transfiguration. And then continuing on north is the ridge of Nazareth. We're going to be talking about Nazareth in just a moment. But here we are standing on the east side of the Sea of Galilee at Gergasa, looking across the Sea of Galilee at these sites: Mount Gilboa, Mount Tabor, the ridge of Nazareth. And in your booklets, page 19, we have a little description of Gergasa. Gergasa, sometimes spelled Gergesa. Also, we have the expression Kursi. Kursi, located along the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee between Susita and Beit Saida. Now, Beit Saida is up at the north end, close by Capernaum, and Beit Saida was the home of some of the fishermen that were associated with Peter. Hippos, another real interesting one, and I've never been on top of Hippos. One of these days, maybe this time, I don't know, we'll get a chance to go up there. But it's been recently excavated and should be quite fascinating to visit sometime. But it sits up on top of a high hill, and it was one of the Decapolis cities. It was a Greek Gentile city in the land of Israel. And it is possible that Susita, or Hippos, by the way, the Hebrew word for horse is Sus. The Greek word for horse is Hippos. This is the horse mountain, Susita or Hippos, one of the Decapolis cities. It may be the city Jesus referred to when he said, a city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Okay? Because it overlooks the Sea of Galilee and can be seen from all over the place because of the houses and their lights and so forth at night. Now, there are a couple of other possible sites, and we'll see some of those when we're at the Sea of Galilee. Even today, there's another site that is still inhabited, and you can see its lights very, very clearly at night, and it really brings to a vivid picture in your mind what Jesus was talking about when he mentioned the city on a hill that cannot be hid. But that may be this Susita. But Gergasa is located between Bethsaida and Susita, along the east side of the Sea of Galilee, the side of the healing of the Gergesene demoniac, and the drowning of the pigs, which we just talked about. You can find that in Mark chapter 5. The Gadarenes were the residents of Gadara, one of the cities of the Decapolis, and the capital of the Roman province of Perea. Today, this region is what we call the Golan Heights. It's also known as Bashan, but we hear politically a lot about the Golan Heights because that's the territory that Syria once held, Israel conquered in the 67 war, and now they hold it. Syria would desperately like it back. Biblically, it's known as Bashan, B-A-S-H-A-N. So the Gadara was one of the cities of the Decapolis, capital of the Roman province of Perea. Okay, so in biblical times, Roman times, New Testament is known as Perea by the Romans, controlled by Herod Antipas. Gadara, also called Gergasa or Gerasa in various manuscripts, was located on the summit of a mountain 6 miles southeast of the Sea of Galilee. The miracle could not have taken place at Gadara itself, for between the lake and the town there's a deep, almost impassable ravine of the Yarmuk River, called in Greek Hieromex. Gadara, which is mentioned in the Gospels only in connection with the healing of the demon-possessed men, or man, was dominant enough to give its name to the entire area, thus the term the region of the Gadarenes in Matthew's account. So people have gone to Gadara and said, well, this miracle couldn't have happened here because of the deep ravine. But in biblical times, Gadara referred not only to the village, but to the whole region. And we know right where the place is within that region where this miracle took place. Because like I said, there's no other place that fits the description anywhere around the Sea of Galilee. Today, there are the remains, point number 4, of the largest known Byzantine monastery in the Holy Land, measuring about 450 by 370 feet. Okay, so now again, when we say Byzantine, what are we talking about? Who are the Byzantines? Anybody have any idea? You want to get this in your mind because it's very, very important to fix some of these periods of time. Okay, in the first century, okay, when Jesus is here, when the apostles are preaching, Israel is under the control of Rome. That's the Roman period. First, second, third centuries. Okay. In the 4th century, a very important historical event took place. That is that Constantine, the Roman emperor, granted toleration to Christianity. Up until that time, Christianity was persecuted by Rome. And we read about the imperial persecutions beginning with Nero in the mid-60s, and then on through the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome is persecuting the Christians. Constantine's mother had been a Christian. So Constantine grants toleration to the Christians. And Constantine moves the capital of the empire from Rome to Byzantium. And so the Roman Empire becomes Christian, in name anyway, at that point. And from the 4th century on until the 7th century, you have the whole land of Israel being controlled by these Byzantine Roman Christians. That's the Byzantine era, okay? And you have a flourishing of Christianity. Unfortunately, the Jews have been forced out of the land of Israel, so you have Byzantine Christians who are in there. Some of them are treating the Jews with a lot of favor, especially up in the north. In this region, in the Galilee, the Jews and the Byzantine Christians lived side by side, cooperated with each other, entered into business agreements with each other. Okay, this is the time of the Byzantines, 4th to the 7th centuries. And the Byzantine Empire continues on for a long time, but it loses control of the Holy Land in the 7th century when the Muslims come through. Okay, so the Byzantine era in the Holy Land is 4th to the 7th century, but the Byzantine Empire is going to go on until it falls to the Muslims much later in about the 13th century. But this is what we're talking about. Point number 4, remains of the largest known Byzantine monastery in the Holy Land. And it measures about 450 by 370 feet. It was discovered in 1970, shortly after the 6 Days War, during construction of a road when bulldozers uncovered pottery shards and the tops of the monastery stone walls. And you have to understand that this is the way it goes in Israel. Anytime somebody starts a construction project, they dig a little bit and they run into something ancient. And as soon as that happens, everything comes to a screeching halt. Yeah. And they call in the archaeologists and they do an archaeological dig. And then they have to figure out some other way to route the road. You know? So then they route the road some other place, and they dig, and they find something else. You know, you don't want to be the guy in charge of Caltrans or Isratrans in Israel, because it's a headache. But they do that, and they have deep respect for the archaeology, and so oftentimes they will go to elaborate lengths to preserve the archaeology, either reroute a road or they'll build it up on an overpass or something like this. In Capernaum, where Peter's house was discovered, they built a church on pillars up over the house so that you could still see the excavations underneath. So, you know, it's a wonderful thing that they have such a love for their ancient history, and they're willing to go to such great lengths to preserve it. Well, here they were building a road. Bulldozers are coming through, and somebody says, "Hey, wait a minute, there's some pottery." Everything comes to a screeching halt, calling the archaeologists, and lo and behold, they discover this huge Byzantine monastery. So, point B, it contains a mosaic floor with pictures of animals, including chickens, geese, doves, cormorants, and fish. Also plants, including citrons, dates, pomegranates, and grapes. Parts of these had been vandalized at some point. The mosaic floor in the baptism room has a Greek inscription which translates as follows: "In the name of the most God-beloved Stephanus, the priest and abbot, was made the mosaic of the Photosterion in the month of December, fourth indication in the time of the pious and Christ-beloved our King Mauritius, first consulate." Pretty lengthy inscription, but that's in the baptismal. Okay, a chapel was excavated in 1980 on the hill overlooking this monastery, and apse in this chapel in a cave where traditionally Jesus met the demoniac, the demon-possessed man of Gadara. And this apse is paved with 3 separate layers of mosaics marking the place where the demoniac lived among the tombs. Was that the actual place? Well, this is Byzantine. It's several hundred years after the fact. So it's based on traditions that people had kept alive for a period of time. It's a good guess. There is some reason to think that's maybe a good starting point for looking for the location. But we have to be careful about these certain identifications just because a church was built somewhere. Think about 200, 300, 400 years. Our own nation is just barely over 200 years old. Okay, so if somebody is talking to you about events that took place, let's say, back at maybe Bunker Hill, if we didn't have accurate maps and so forth from that day, and all we had was kind of handed down tradition 200 years later, how accurate do you think those handed down oral traditions might be? Well, they might be, but you want to be careful about taking it at face value. I mentioned Constantine, 4th century, which starts the Byzantine era. Constantine's mother, Helena, visited the Holy Land. Remember I said she was a Christian. And she visited the Holy Land with the specific purpose in mind of identifying a lot of these holy places. She, above anything else, she wanted to find the true cross of Christ. That was her biggest goal. And she found somebody who showed her the true cross of Christ, probably for a price. And that wasn't the true cross? Who knows? Was this old piece of wood still around several hundred years later? It's not likely, but somebody showed it to her anyway. Over the course of history, through the Crusades, Crusaders brought back to Europe so many pieces of the true cross of Christ that you could construct hundreds of crosses out of these pieces. So again, you have to be careful about some of the traditional locations. Nevertheless, we're probably fairly close when we have a traditional identification. We could say we're in approximately the right area. Okay. Other times we have enough biblical data or other kind of extra biblical confirmation that we can speak with more authority. But this region of the Gadarenes, we know the region, we know pretty much the place where this took place. And very close by, there is in fact this monastery. Here's another picture of the steep cliffs coming down, like right up in here, steep cliff coming right down into the Sea of Galilee. So this is probably the cliff where it happened. Now, to the west, if you're near the north end of the Sea of Galilee, you can look on any of these maps up here and see the Sea of Galilee. At the northwest end, if you head westward, you're going to come to Nazareth. Next place we want to talk about. Right here on the slide, what we're looking at is the pass which goes between Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee. Again, Sea of Galilee over 600 feet below sea level. Nazareth is above sea level, so you're going from Nazareth down towards the Sea of Galilee. Through this pass and downhill, you'll find Capernaum. And on one side of this pass is a very beautiful mountain called Mount Arbel, which we will have a chance to visit. And you get a beautiful view of all of the Sea of Galilee from atop Mount Arbel. And it's on the right side of this pass here. Here is Mount Arbel. And down below is the plain just at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. Around to the right of the corner of this cliff here, you would see the Sea of Galilee. But you get an idea of what kind of a view you can get from up on top of Mount Arbel. It's just a little hike. Drive up a little ways and park, and then we hike, I don't know, half a mile or something up to the top of Mount Arbel. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. And here's our group up there on Mount Arbel, just about almost the same spot where that last picture was taken from. Again, here's the valley down below. Around to the right, around this cliff here, you would have the Sea of Galilee. Okay, now, take a look at Mount Arbel on page 20, located northwest of Tiberias, west of Magdala, an imposing mountain. Notice honeycombed with caves. And these caves in the side of Mount Arbel have been used by people to hide out from enemies throughout history. One of the most important times was in the days of King Herod, when Jews who were targeted by Herod for an insurrection were hiding out from him. And there's a story that is recorded in Josephus about how Herod sent fire into those caves to flush these Jews out. A battle was fought between the Hasmoneans and the Bacchides there. That's recorded in 1 Maccabees 9:2. 1 Maccabees is a non-canonical book, non-inspired book, but a book filled with a lot of interesting history about the intertestamental period. And so it's not a bad source to read. Number 4, Herod fought the Zealots who hid in the caves above the plain, according to Josephus, Antiquities, Book 14, and paragraph 445. Josephus is an invaluable source of information about events taking place in the intertestamental era. And so if you want to do a little bit of research on your own to help set the stage for understanding the background of the New Testament, the books of Josephus, the works of Josephus. He has one called The Wars of the Jews, another one called The Antiquities of the Jews, and then he has another work called Against Appian, and then there is his biography, his autobiography. Those 4 works are the works of Josephus. Here we have reference to Antiquities, where he talks about the Zealots trying to hide out from King Herod. And then after the destruction of the temple, Second Temple, it was the seat of the priestly family of Jeshua. So that all has to do with Arbel, which was the last slide that we looked at. And I meant to read this while we were still on that slide, but when I'm recording, I can't very easily back up. So there you have that. We come next to Dan. Dan is one of my favorite places to visit in Israel. It's a nature preserve today, and it's a beautiful, green, lush area with lots of water. And as we've said before, there are not very many places in the Middle East where you have lots of water. But we're actually up very close now to the foot of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon snow-capped much of the year. Because of the limestone undergirdings of Mount Hermon, there is what's called karstic activity. The geological pressure from the limestone on the water down below. The water melts from the snow, seeps down through these cavities down underground, and then karstic pressure forces the water up into these springs all around the base of Mount Hermon. And what you're looking at here is Dan Spring, one of these springs. There are probably thousands of such springs around the base. These little springs come up, and some of them not so little, like this one, and the water begins to flow downhill by gravity into what? The Syrian-African rift, collecting in the low point, and forming then the Jordan River. So the upper Jordan River is formed by the Dan Spring and a number of other springs. When we look at Caesarea Philippi, we'll see another such spring. Again, because that's also near the base of Mount Hermon. And along with Dan, right next to Dan, we have Caesarea Philippi listed here in this same section. We're going to talk about both of them kind of together. They're just within a couple of miles of each other. Number one, located far to the north at the foot of Mount Hermon and the Golan Heights and at the headwaters of the Jordan River. As the northernmost city of Israel, the name of the city, together with Beersheba in the south, defined the borders of the land, and we have this expression from Dan to Beersheba, found in Judges 20, verse 1, and I think a couple of other times in the Old Testament. So Dan, this is the furthest north you would have in Israel in biblical times. You go further than this and you go up into Phoenicia. Okay? Today, further north from this is Lebanon. And when you're at Dan Spring here, you're almost at the Lebanese border. Just a little ways further from here, and you start running into minefields and barbed wire. Okay, but right here, you barely get any idea that there's any tension or warfare. It's beautiful, it's peaceful. A few years back, some of the rockets that were fired into Israel from Lebanon set off a forest fire in this area and burned up some of this beautiful preserve. But there's so much water, it's coming back beautifully, and so we're seeing it here. Point number 3, Tel Dan was the site of many important cities from Canaanite times between 2700 and 2400 BC. Now, when we talk about Tel Dan, we're introduced to an archaeological term, this word tel, T-E-L, and you'll see it lots and lots of times. Who can tell me what a tel is?
Just mounds where the cities are built on.
Yeah, mounds where the cities have been built one upon another. So when you see a hill in Israel, it's not always a natural hill. Oftentimes it's where there was a city at one time. The city underwent destruction. Since in ancient times they didn't have massive earth-moving equipment like we have today, when the city was rebuilt, it simply gets rebuilt on top of the rubble. And so you get a second layer on top of the first layer, and it's higher than the first layer. Then another destruction. Later on, they come in, rebuild again, build on top of the rubble. If there's the passage of a fair amount of time between two civilizations, the earlier rubble will, with time, get filled in with dirt and so forth. So what you get when you cut into one of these tells, it's like a stack of pancakes, and each new pancake is a geological era, and you can dig down. The further down you go, the earlier you get in history. And then by examining things such as pottery especially, becomes very important for dating these different levels, because we know what the pottery looked like at different times. So you dig down, you find a piece of pottery, you can look at its style, its shape, and this sort of thing, and you can say, well, then this is from such and such an era. You can date that level. Then you know anything above it is more recent, anything below it is more ancient. And if you find other pottery at other levels, then you can date these things. What you can't do very easily is relate one tell to another tell. You can tell within one tell relative date between levels, but you have another tell, you don't know when it began or when it ended unless you find independent sources of dating that tell. Now there's a tell at Dan, tell Dan. This receives the name Dan because of the tribe of Dan. Now in the book of Joshua, the Israelite tribe of Dan was given a tribal allotment, not way up in the north, but very far to the south on the coastline. And last week, I think it was, we were talking about Tel Aviv, and just on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, you have Jaffa. This was the region that was given to Dan. But the Bible tells us that Dan was not able to conquer the Canaanites living in that area. And so they stayed with some of the other Israelites further up in the mountains. Later, in the time of the Judges, the Danites, unable to conquer their own territory, heard about a Canaanite city way up in the north that was without adequate defenses. So they said, let's go take that territory. That's Tel Dan. That's this area right here. So when we read about Dan and Dan Springs, that's where they settled. Now then, later on, you know, after the time of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel split into two. Okay, David becomes king roughly 1000 BC. His son Solomon has the most power that any Israelite king has ever had, the widest extent of his domain. But Solomon's son, Rehoboam, could not hold the kingdom together, and it split. The northern kingdom being ruled by Jeroboam the first. And Jeroboam, in order to keep his people loyal to him, had to establish a new worship center. He couldn't have his people going down to Jerusalem to worship because that's in the southern kingdom. So what does he do? He sets up an altar at Dan, the furthest point to the north, and erects there a golden calf, an idol, but dedicated to the true God, to Yahweh, the God of Israel. But he's going to worship the true God of Israel in a manner that violates the Ten Commandments by using a golden calf. So he actually had a northern worship center in Dan, and then he had a southern center further into the south. But the Dan worship center was very important to him. If you get people to worship up there, he wouldn't be threatened by them defecting to the south, to Jerusalem. So we'll take a look at the tell here at Dan in just a moment, but let's read some more in our notes. We just read about tell Dan, point number 3, we're on page 21. Point number 4, springs in the area produce abundant amounts of water, forming the primary source of the upper Jordan River. The springs are fed by snow and rain which fall on Mount Hermon. The water seeps into the mountain, dividing into hundreds of springs by the time it reaches the foot. Together, these springs form the largest karstic spring in the Middle East. The powerful spring provides up to 62,872 million gallons of water a year, with 238 million cubic meters. This is about 22.5 gallons of water every second. So that's a lot of water, especially in the Middle East. So, number 5, during the Canaanite period, the city was known by the name Leshem or Laish. So it's in Judges 18, you have the story of the tribe of Dan going up there against Laish. Okay? Or properly pronounced Laish. Laish. Number 6, Canaanite Laish was conquered and settled by the tribe of Dan, 12th century BC. The tribe of Dan had previously occupied a small area west of the foothills of the Judean mountains. 600 members of the tribe migrated northward, and after conquering Laish, called the name of the city Dan after the name of Dan, their father. That, according to Judges 18:29. And you remember they stole this household priest and took him along with them. And while they were at it, they stole the household gods and took the idols with them too. So even long before Rehoboam, you have a problem with idol worship and false worship connected with Dan up here in the far north. Number 8, the high place exposed at Dan was established by Jeroboam I of Israel. And by the way, this high place has been excavated. We will see it when we're there. This was the false worship cult center at the time of Jeroboam I. And we'll see some pictures here in just a minute. At the end of the 10th century BC, after the division of the kingdom, Jeroboam I built altars bearing a golden calf in two cities. One in Bethel, the other in Dan, and the people went up to worship even unto Dan. 1 Kings 12:29-30. The high place of Dan was destroyed when the city was captured by Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. And remember, it was the Assyrians that came and took the northern kingdom into captivity. That was actually God's judgment of the northern kingdom because of their idolatry. Okay? So God raises up a godless Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser, as his instrument of judgment. And Tiglath-Pileser actually comes and destroys this idol cult center and does God's will. That's an amazing story. 732 BC. Soon thereafter, it was restored, but never regained its former importance. Okay. Did I talk to you about the abbreviations BCE and CE as opposed to BC and AD? I can't remember which class I've discussed that with and which I haven't. Most of us are familiar with BC and AD. Okay, BC before Christ, AD standing for Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. But it has become common in many archaeological circles to change that to BCE and CE. So that CE stands for the Common Era, BCE before the Common Era. And this is because so many people involved in archaeology are Jews. They don't acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord, and they have no reason to refer to this current time as the year of our Lord because they don't acknowledge him. So in deference to the Jews, academia has adopted these other titles, BCE and CE, but they mean exactly the same things as BC and AD. So you'll see both references, and don't be confused by it. And you can have your opinions about what you think is right. I would just assume that we kept BC and AD, but this is what we find in the literature. So it's there. You just have to realize it. So in our notes here, you're seeing at this point these dates being referred to in one place as BC, in another place you're seeing BCE. So no big deal. Number 10. One of the fascinating finds from Tel Dan, discovered in 1993. That was not very long ago. A piece of probably JD probably thinks it was ancient history, but for the rest of us, 1993 wasn't very long ago. Yeah, amen. Okay. A piece of fossilized tablet from the second half of the 9th century BC, carved into it an inscription from an Aramean king, believed to be either Hazael or Ben-Hadad, king of Damascus. Notice this, boasting of his victory over the king of Israel of the house of David. And this is the first time that the name House of David has been discovered outside of the Bible. It was discovered here at Dan and recorded by a Gentile king. So quite interesting. Of course, it doesn't surprise you or me. But for all those, academic skeptics who say the Bible is just a bunch of stories that were made up, a bunch of myths, You know, it's interesting when we find this kind of confirmation. Okay, they're a reference to the house of David. Okay, let's take a look at some of these pictures around Dan here. Here's Dan Spring. Very beautiful. Another picture, you can see the water coming down. Island, that's my son David standing on the island there. Back before Delilah cut his hair off. Dan Spring, lots and lots of water. Here's the excavation of the high place, where Jeroboam I had his golden calf, and where the Israelites would have come to worship. You can see the stairways leading up, and then the altar would have been up in this area. Okay, the stairs on the left side of the image lead up to the top of the platform of this religious center. The platform is made of hewn limestone blocks. In the lower left portion of the image is a portion of the northern wall that enclosed the area where a large sacrificial altar was located. Okay, so this is on the right-hand side is south, on the left-hand side is north. So up here on this northern wall is the altar. And so there you have the status of the excavations several years ago now. We talked about Mount Hermon, and Tel Dan, where we just were looking at pictures, sits near the foot of Mount Hermon. This is Mount Hermon, snow-capped. It's really not a single mountain, but it is a mountain range. And you see how long this is. Mount Hermon is a mountain range. But up near the high point, this region marks the kind of the northeast corner of Israel, and 3 countries all share this mountain: Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And their borders all meet on this mountain. So it's a militarily sensitive area. Despite the fact that it is militarily sensitive, there is skiing on Mount Hermon. It's pretty much the only place in Israel where you can ski. The Israeli army also carries out, snow maneuvers for practice on Mount Hermon. Israel's got everything. They've got snow, they've got desert, they've got waters, they've got, they've got big cities, they've got little villages, they've got nomads, they've got everything, all packed into this little postage stamp-sized piece of real estate. But now, moving further south from Dan, and I would say maybe halfway between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, roughly, kind of out in the middle there, is another important city, ancient city, and again, this word Tel. Okay, so we talked about a Tel and how we have these civilizations built on top of each other like a stack of pancakes. Tel, well, you'll often hear it referred to as Tel Hazor. The correct pronunciation, Chatzor. Tel Chatzor. Okay, so this is the view looking north at the citadel of the Tel. Okay, see this mound right here? Flat top, sloping sides. Very typical appearance of a Tel. Okay, because it's been built up, built up, built up. The sides are sloping, because the higher you go, the narrower it gets. Okay, but a flat top because it's had a city built on that. And there are, by the way, there are hundreds of Tels throughout Israel that have never been yet excavated. They're just waiting for somebody to come along with a grant from some university and start excavating and finding some exciting ancient biblical city. But Hatzor has been excavated quite extensively, and it was a major city in Old Testament times. It was, in fact, one of Solomon's chariot cities. And I think 2 weeks ago I gave you a paper listing Solomon's chariot cities. And I don't think I brought mine with me tonight. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the chariot cities again when we get to Megiddo. But Solomon, in order to defend his kingdom, had an extensive network of these chariot cities, where he had horses and chariots stationed with soldiers ready to respond to an alert at a moment's notice. They had series of signal towers set up throughout Israel with, ready to have their fires lit. And this was the internet of the ancient time. This is how you communicated in ancient times, was by these signal fires. And so signals could be sent by fire to alert the outpost in any of these chariot cities to respond immediately. So one of them was in Hatzor. Here is the ancient altar at Hatzor, and a human sacrifice sitting atop this altar. Okay, a huge ashlar altar that was found on the lower portion of Hatzor. The stone originally may have been used in the Middle Bronze Age II building, but in its final usage, it functioned as an altar or a place of slaughtering animals in the late Bronze Age temple. On top of the altar are depressions for slaughtering and the draining of blood. Probably not an Israelite altar in the Bronze Age, but a Canaanite altar at that time, okay, before the Israelites had conquered it. Solomon comes along in the Iron Age. Okay, bronze precedes iron. Iron is stronger than bronze, so Iron Age preceded the Bronze Age. Israel came into the Iron Age later than the Philistines. So in the time of King Saul, you find that the Jews do not have their own ironsmiths. In order to get iron implements, they have to go to the Philistines, who have ironsmiths and can sell them iron implements, or they can sharpen iron implements. But the Jews, in the time of King Saul, are still in the Bronze Age. The Philistines have come into the Bronze Age. Under David and Solomon, Israel begins to enter into the Iron Age. Now, at Hatzor, we find an interesting water system. And in many of the places that we will visit, we will see some of these fascinating water systems. We're moving now south from Mount Hermon. We're away from the Jordan River. Once again, water is very, very precious. If you're going to have a civilization, you've got to have water. So how do you get water? Well, oftentimes you have to dig down to it. So you can dig a well, or you could dig a tunnel with a pathway leading down to the water, and then you just walk down the pathway until you get to the water, and you fill up your bucket, and you carry it back up on your head. And this is what we find at Tel Hatzor, this tunnel here that you're looking at, and steps going down into it, very ancient, and it's going to go all the way down to the water table. This is a view of the entrance to the underground 82-foot long diagonal tunnel that is located at the foot of the vertical shaft. The diagonal tunnel did not descend to a spring like at Megiddo, Gibeon, and Yerushalayim, but to the water table where water collected and it could be drawn. So in other places, and we'll see at Megiddo, there's a tunnel that actually goes out through and comes out at the outside of the mound where there's a spring. The spring is actually located just inside, but it's actually a spring. But here, it actually goes down. Okay, Sepphoris. Let's see. We need to look at our notes about Hatzor. The bottom of page 22, 9.5 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, overlooking the swampy Hula Valley. I should mention something about the Hula Valley while we're at it, because Hatzor overlooks the Hula Valley. Oftentimes in your Bible maps, you will see, like you can see up here behind Linda, you can see the Dead Sea in the south, then the Jordan River goes up, you see the Sea of Galilee, the harp-shaped body of water. Then the upper Galilee goes up and you see a smaller lake, a little tiny lake, that is labeled in your Bible maps oftentimes as Lake Hula. Okay? It was never really a lake. It was a swamp. Okay? And it was a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and in ancient times it caused a lot of problems with malaria, up really until modern times. The modern Israelites who came into the land to try to resettle it in the 20th century drained the swamps to clear out the mosquitoes and deal with the problem of malaria. So what they did was they dug canals, they channeled this water into pools where they created fish farms. They also planted lots and lots of eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus are not native to the land of Israel, but they brought them in from Australia and New Zealand. And why eucalyptus? Because they're a very thirsty tree. They'll drink up lots and lots of water. And so between digging these channels and the planting of eucalyptus trees, they were able to dry up the swamps, get rid of the mosquitoes, get rid of the malaria problem. Then, guess what? Late 20th century, along come the ecologists. They say, you've ruined the natural state of the land. And so we've got to bring back the swamp. And so they've been working to try to reestablish the swamp, and they have actually restored some of the swampy areas, not the entire place. And of course they're watching it now for mosquito control. But it has become a place where hundreds and hundreds of migratory birds come and stop on their migratory route from north to south. And bird watchers from all over the world like to come to this area of Israel to watch birds in the Hula Valley. So it's kind of interesting. It's a little bit like our swamp out here. It's kind of an albatross around our neck. It's land that the Shasta Bible College had that we planned to build on. And the ecologists said, no, you can't do that. It's wetlands. And so our hands were tied. So now we can't build on it. All we can do is pay taxes on it. And although we've been able to find a way around that now, thank God. But in the meantime, well, at this time of the year, we've got a nice lake out here, and it is pretty. And, so we'll enjoy it because that's what God has given us. So Israel has its own problem with the nature lovers and all of that. But there are lots of fish farms in this area, and it's in this area that you find Tel Hatzor. Okay, it's nearby Lake Hule, or Swamp Hule. So we were looking at page 23, the largest tell in Israel. Watch, it's covering a total of 205 acres and 21 layers of cities. Okay, so it's been destroyed and rebuilt at least 21 times. So that's quite something. And there are actually two tells. One is called the upper city, the other is called the lower city. The upper city is smaller, 30 acres, containing 21 strata of civilizations. But it's the lower city that is much larger, but hasn't been around for quite as long. It contains only 5 strata of civilizations. Tel Hatzor was very important because it lay along the Via Maris, what we talked about, this trunk route running along the Mediterranean. It was a Canaanite royal city and the leader of the Northern Confederation against Joshua. Now, when you read about Israel entering into the Promised Land under Joshua, they enter into these wars against various Canaanites. There was a northern coalition of Canaanite tribes, Joshua chapter 11, and Tel Hatzor was the leader of that. Now, when we visit Hatzor, you will see excavations going back to these Canaanite times, and even to pre-Canaanite times. So it's been thoroughly excavated, well preserved. It's one of the really, really delightful things to see. But the city, according to number 5, was destroyed by Joshua. We read that in Joshua 11. So he conquers the Canaanites, puts the city to the fire, and destroys it. Number 6, a Canaanite city oppressed Israel after the judgeship of Ehud. So even though Joshua destroys it, Canaanites move back in, they rebuild it again. Okay, so we've got now another layer on our tell. Then point number 7, Judges chapter 4, it is taken by Barak. Okay, this is not Ehud Barak, the defense minister of Israel today, but this is Barak the judge in the book of Judges. Judges 4:23-24. Number 8, the army of Hatzor was led by Sisera. So now, once again, Canaanites are in charge, and they are going to lead a rebellion against Israel, or war. according to 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 9. And then later than that, point number 9, it becomes one of the 3 key chariot cities fortified by Solomon, 1 Kings 9:15. So we read about 3 key cities. There were really probably more like 6 or 7 chariot cities that we can talk about, but 3 major chariot cities. Okay, the water tunnel we talked about, part of the water system. Notice, built by King Ahaz, whom we read about in the Bible. It was destroyed by Tiglath-Pileser of the Assyrians in 732 BC. And then in 144 BC, now moving into intertestamental period, we're beyond the Old Testament, not yet in the New Testament. It's taken by Jonathan Maccabee after defeating the army of Demetrius II. Okay, so quite a history for Chatzor. Let's talk about Sepphoris and then we'll take a break. But Sepphoris is just on the, I guess, I was going to say it's on the outskirts of Nazareth, and today that's true. In biblical times, you would have said Nazareth was on the outskirts of Sepphoris. Sepphoris was the big major city. This was where the wealthy Jews lived. Nazareth was nothing but just a tiny, despicable village. And Sepphoris has been well preserved. It's a beautiful city. Notice in Hebrew it is called Tzipori, after the Hebrew word for a bird, tzipor, because it sits up on this high kind of hill, and so it's like it's perched up high like a bird. So the Hebrew name for this city is Tzipori, but the Greek name for it is Sepphoris. Sepphoris, located in south-central Galilee, about 4 miles north and west of Nazareth. Though not mentioned in the Bible, it was one of the chief cities of Galilee until near the end of the 4th century A.D. Josephus refers to it as the ornament of all Galilee. Interesting that it's not mentioned in the New Testament, isn't it? It was a huge, wealthy, important city. Maybe it's not too surprising that Jesus didn't care to go there. This was just not the kind of place that Jesus spent much time. He spent his time with the poor and the lowly and the humble. But Josephus refers to it as the ornament of all Galilee. 55 BC, Gabinus, the proconsul of Syria, made it the district capital of Galilee. 37 BC, it was conquered by Herod the Great during a snowstorm. In 4 BC, it was destroyed by Quintilius Varus, the legate of Syria, and the people were sold into slavery in response to a riot upon the death of Herod the Great. Now, 4 BC, we're getting just about contemporaneous with the birth of Jesus Christ. Okay, so right about the same time, just within a year or two, we have this edict given that everybody must go to their hometown to be registered for the taxation. So Joseph and Mary are going to leave Nazareth, right outside of Sepphoris, and head south to Bethlehem. But right about this time, this city was destroyed, and because of a revolt by the Jews. In 3 BC, it was rebuilt and fortified by Herod Antipas and grew to a population of 30,000. Compare this to Nazareth, 4 miles away, with a population likely less than 200. So you think of the proximity of these two cities. Nazareth is the one everybody knows about today because of Jesus. But in biblical times, probably fewer than 200 people living in Nazareth. Sepphoris, over 30,000. Big city, wealthy city. Dating to the 1st century AD, the basilica building covered the entire city block, 130 by 200 feet. The floor plan is much like a basilica, and so it's called the Basilica Building. The walls on the north and south are lined with small shops or rooms, but enter into the building They enter into the building, not to the exterior, so it's like a covered mall. The best description would be an indoor mall, but smaller in scale. The floor in the center held a large mosaic and a pool at each end. The mosaic is of water scenes, fishes, and the like. So you get the idea of the opulence of this area. To have a building like this in a city was just very exceptional. And we have a couple of pictures coming up here in just a moment of these mosaics. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, it became a Gentile city and was renamed Vio Caesarea. Vio Caesarea. Now, Bar Kokhba revolt. Another thing, you'll hear a lot about the Bar Kokhba revolt. In the first century, of course, you have Christ, you know, the birth of the church in the first century, and then the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. That all happens in the first century. And there were Jews that were in revolt against Rome, and that was why the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. But they didn't stamp out the revolt entirely. They quelled it for a time. In the second century, that is the 100s, this revolt gets stirred up again. And a Jewish leader by the name of Bar Kokhba leads a group of Jewish insurgents against Rome in a battle. It goes on for quite some time. It's called the Revolt of Bar Kokhba. The Jews, many of the Jews thought Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Okay, they'd rejected Christ, they rejected the Lord Jesus. Now they're following this Bar Kokhba. And Bar Kokhba did have a number of brilliant and valiant victories against the Romans, but eventually the Romans stamped out his rebellion. So you'll read a lot about that. Here's one reference to it here, page 24, point number 8, in reference to Sepphoris. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, it becomes a Gentile city. It's the home and burial place of many great rabbis. In the 4th century, okay, now think again, 4th century, beginning of the Byzantine era. In the 4th century, there was an attempt made to build a church at Sepphoris. Okay, so this would have been a Byzantine church, but they ran into difficulty as there were many famous Jewish scholars living there. Tradition has it that Sepphoris is the birthplace of St. Anne, the mother of Mary. So it's possible that Sepphoris might have been the hometown of Mary, because tradition says that Mary's mother, St. Anne, lived there. The Crusaders built a church over the site of a pre-existing Byzantine church in commemoration of St. Anne. Okay, so again, we just talked about the Byzantines, now we're talking about Crusaders. Get the picture. You have pagan Romans ruling Israel, then the Christian Byzantines. After them, the Muslims come in, and then the Crusaders come from Europe. So you get a Christian kingdom of Jerusalem. They get kicked out by Muslims. They come back in again. You get a second Crusader period. And then it just lasts a little time before it's taken over again by other Muslims. Now, I speak just very, very generally about Muslims. There are all kinds of different Muslim groups. And we can talk about those different Muslim groups at another time. But you want to give the big, broad picture so that you see what's going on. You've got Romans, Byzantines, Muslims, Crusaders, Muslims, Crusaders, and then Muslims again, until World War I. The last Muslim group that holds it is the Ottoman Empire out of Turkey. And we will have to talk about the Ottomans quite a bit when we come to talk about modern-day Israel and how Israel came into existence. But the Ottoman Empire was a huge empire at one time. And it came to an end with World War I. Okay, last point here about Sepphoris. In AD 363, it was destroyed by an earthquake. Okay, we said Israel is an earthquake-prone region. And And so lots of times these cities get destroyed by earthquakes. Here's an aerial view of Sepphoris that has been excavated. You can see lots of buildings. Here's the big amphitheater, kind of in the middle here. Here is one of the tile floors that we talked about. Look at the beautiful depictions of wildlife, kind of the flora. Quite something. This is a large building. This mosaic shows festivities in Egypt. Okay, Egypt's a long way away, but they've got a picture of Egypt when the Nile reached its peak. The lighthouse from Alexandria, the Pharos, is also depicted in this picture. Here it is right up near the top. The tower in the center of the hunting scene is a nilometer. That's this one right here. A nilometer was used to measure the rise of the Nile during its inundation. Okay, so remember in Egypt, the Nile would overflow its banks, and that would wash out all this topsoil, would cover the region with this topsoil, and then they could plant their crops there. They were dependent on the overflowing of the Nile for their crops, and that's a nilometer. This beautiful mosaic is known as the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, because it looks somewhat reminiscent of the Mona Lisa. From the 3rd century AD, in the home of an important Gentile person, possibly the city or district governor. The triclinium mosaic includes 1.5 million stones in 28 different colors. Now that is really elaborate. The beautiful woman in the mosaic is known today as the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. She's depicted wearing a laurel garland and earrings. And so after our break, we'll come back, we'll talk about Nazareth itself. But let's take about a 10-minute break at this point. It's 7:30 right now. We're now going to go look at Nazareth. And this is up at the top of our review notes. So we're kind of picking up for all of those massive numbers of students that are taking the quiz. JD. Listen up. Okay, Nazareth, aerial view. So now we talked about Nazareth in the time of Christ being a very tiny village of less than 200 people. Look at the city of Nazareth today. Look at all these buildings and roads, and it just spills off the edge of the screen. And this is because of the fame that Nazareth has gotten, all because of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the only reason Nazareth is as big a city as it is today. In Nazareth, we have a number of churches. One is the Church of the Annunciation on the traditional site where the angel made the announcement to Mary that she was going to bear the Messiah. Is it the original site? Your guess is as good as mine. It was somewhere in Nazareth. It might have been here. It might not have been here. This was probably identified again during the time that Helena was in Israel, trying to find these holy sites several hundred years after the fact. The Catholic Church, of course, and even the Eastern Orthodox Church, have in their theology this idea that there are holy sites, where if you visit these holy sites, you can do works of penance. And throughout the history of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox, people who have been instructed by a priest to travel to a holy site on pilgrimage to pray in a certain site are doing works of penance in order to gain forgiveness of sins. This is why there are all these churches built on these sites. And the tradition goes back a long ways, but it's all tied up with a salvation by works as opposed to salvation by grace through faith. This is why I don't particularly like to refer to our tours to Israel as a pilgrimage, because the term pilgrimage in a religious context has that connotation that it is traveling to a holy site to do penance. Now, I do have somewhere in a file somewhere a paper signed by Teddy Kollek, who was then mayor of Jerusalem, testifying that I had visited Jerusalem on a pilgrimage. And so I thought that was a nice thing that they did to give us Christian travelers that nice piece of paper signed by the mayor of Jerusalem. but it's like I say, it's filed away somewhere. I don't like to display it too much. I really like to disassociate myself from this pilgrimage idea. We're not going there to have a spiritual experience per se, although it is very likely that you will have some deep emotional and spiritual responses to the places where we are. But the Bible does not in any way, shape, or form say that you can become holy by visiting a holy site. Okay? We worship God in spirit and in truth, because God is spirit. Jesus told the woman at the well, the day is coming when neither in this mountain Gerizim nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father, but you'll worship him in spirit and in truth, because God can be worshipped in any place. Worship is a frame of mind. Worship is an attitude of our heart. Worship is not all these externals. Believe it or not, worship is not even music. Okay? Even though we might worship God with music, music is not worship. Worship is the way we approach God. Okay? So, or worship is the way we approach God. And so, here we have the Church of the Annunciation. There are churches all over the Holy Land. Lots, very, very ornate churches, beautiful churches, and we'll see some of them. But we're not going to visit a lot of churches. Some Christian tours go to Israel, and their sole purpose is to visit all these holy sites. And they go from church to church to church to church. And I think it's very sad that they don't get a view of the land, and they don't see the places that the Bible is describing. So we're there to see the land. We're there to see what the place looks like, to get a better idea of how we can study our Bible and get more out of our study of the Bible. But the Church of the Annunciation is here in Nazareth, perhaps on the very site where the angel made an announcement to Mary that she was to bear the Christ child. If it wasn't here, it was somewhere nearby. And even if it was here, that church doesn't give you any idea what it looked like in Mary's day. Down in the Church of the Annunciation, there is this table in a sacred grotto associated with the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary, that she would bear the Messiah. This is the main altar in the grotto, and the words inscribed on it, not clearly visible, state in Latin, which would not have been Mary's native language. Here the Word was made flesh. Okay? So this is true. The Word was made flesh when Jesus was conceived of the angel. Now we say, well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Yes, but when did the life begin? It began at conception. So the conception is in Nazareth. So yes, that's true. Here the Word was made flesh. Mary's well, one of two possible water sources for the ancient city of Nazareth. So this may very likely this was the well where Mary would have gone to draw water, or maybe the Lord Jesus as a boy was sent to gather water for the family. Very possibly. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about Nazareth before we go on to talk about Armageddon. Point number one about Nazareth. It was located inside a bowl atop the Nazareth Ridge. Now notice this, north of the Jezreel Valley. Okay, so question number two on our review question. Say, what valley lies below Nazareth to the south? Well, if Nazareth is located north of the Jezreel Valley, then the valley south of Nazareth was Jezreel. Okay. Jezreel. We'll talk about Jezreel. This is the name given to it in many ancient sources. It goes by a couple of other names. And so it is also called the valley or the plain of Esdraelon. Esdraelon. And then thirdly, it is known as the Valley of Armageddon. All three of those titles refer to the same valley to the south of Nazareth. Jezreel, Esdraelon, and Armageddon. But Nazareth itself runs approximately from south-southwest to north-northeast. To the south, there's a sharp drop down into the Jezreel Valley, that is, the plain of Esdraelon. The base of the valley is 1,214 feet above sea level. Steep hills rise up on the north and east sides, while on the west side they reach up to 1,640 feet and command an impressive view. One of the places we will almost certainly visit is the brow of Nazareth, right on the edge of this hillside, this cliff, overlooking the Esdraelon or Jezreel Valley. And keep that in mind. We'll talk that when we get down to point number 9 and 10. But let's go to point number 2. The mild climate in the valley causes wildflowers and fruit to flourish. This valley of Jezreel is one of the agriculturally very, very rich areas of Israel. So right outside of Nazareth. 3, although it has existed since the Canaanite period, it is not mentioned in the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, Josephus, or in the Talmud. Okay, so point number 3 asks, Nazareth has existed since what period? Well, since the Canaanite period. Well, if it's not mentioned in any of these sources, how do we know that? Archaeology, through the excavations. Okay, so we can tell by the excavations that there was very early settlement, but never a large settlement until modern times. Never once mentioned in the Old Testament. So I think we have a question about that. How many times is Nazareth referred to in the Old Testament? Number 4. What's the answer to that question? 0. Okay. Not mentioned in the Old Testament. Not mentioned in the Apocrypha. Not mentioned in Josephus. Not mentioned in the Jewish Talmud. At the time of Christ, it was a small village, probably fewer than 200 people. To judge by the rock tombs, the early town was higher up the West Hill than present-day Nazareth. There are 2 possible water supplies. Okay, we saw one of them, the Well of Mary. The first, which is larger, lies in the valley and has been called Mary's Well since the year A.D. 1100. Okay, now that's from the Crusaders period. That's a long time after the biblical times. Okay, to us, we think 1100 is ancient history. But it's not a real reliable source of information about what things were like in biblical times. What happened? The Crusaders arrived in Nazareth. The Crusaders are Christians. They're building a Christian kingdom, and they want to locate these holy places. So they asked some Muslim who's been living in that area, where is Mary's well? And he says, pay me 5 shekels and I'll show it to you. So they pay him 5 shekels, and he takes him down the street and says, here it is. Okay, but this is 1100 AD. So be careful of these associations. However, since there are only 2 known water sources, maybe you got a 50-50 chance. Maybe that was the well where Mary got water. Okay, it's been called that since 1100, but there's no trace of early dwellings nearby. The second is a very small fountain called the New Well, in an angle formed by a projection of the West Hill. The Byzantine church in town lay closer to this. Okay, so the Byzantine church, much earlier than the Crusaders. Okay, now we're 4th century, 5th century. Still, a couple hundred years at least away from biblical times. So is this accurate? Well, it's closer than the Crusaders. So maybe the New Well is more likely the actual well where Mary got her water. So if you're looking for holy water because Mary got her water there, well, you have to take a gamble. Which one is it? Is it Mary's well? Is it the new well? It's one or the other. We don't know. But we can narrow it down to these two possibilities. Number 7 was the home of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, and there are some biblical references. It was a city of disrepute, John 1:45-46. What does that say? Does anybody know? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Okay, when they heard that Jesus was from Nazareth, they said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Okay, that was the reputation Nazareth had. Christ returned to Nazareth on 2 occasions, and they are recorded here in Luke 4 and in Luke 13, or Matthew 13. Now, in Luke 4, Jesus will go into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Since he is in his own hometown, but he's been away, they give him the honor of reading the scriptures. So the synagogue official in charge of the Torah scroll hands Jesus the scripture. He turns to the scripture reading for the day, which happens to be Isaiah chapter 61. And it talks about one who will come and proclaim the gospel of good tidings to the poor and will perform miracles. Jesus stops halfway through the verse and rolls up the scroll and takes his seat. And the eyes of everybody in the synagogue are on him. Why did he stop reading? And Jesus says, today, I tell you, this is fulfilled in your sight. Why did he stop where he did? Because the verse goes on to say, and the day of the vengeance of our God, which is a description of the tribulation period, which is yet future. So Jesus came bringing a gospel of peace, healing people's sicknesses. He did not come at his first coming bringing the day of vengeance. The day of vengeance will be associated with his second coming. So you don't get that just reading Isaiah 61 by itself. There's a gap of at least 2,000 years in the middle of the verse. But Jesus stopped his reading at that point, and he said, today this is fulfilled. Okay, that's recorded in Luke chapter 4. Number 10, the steep scarp of Jebel Kafsa, overlooking the plain, is traditionally called the Mount of Precipitation. But this is unlikely to be authentic, since this was not the hill on which their city was built. And we'll visit this. This is called the Brow of Nazareth, or the hill of precipitation, or the Mount of Precipitation. It's the site that overlooks the Jezreel Valley. So was this the authentic site? We don't know for sure. But after Jesus was in the synagogue at Nazareth, the people of the town took him out to the Brow of Nazareth, where they were going to stone him. Biblical stoning, most of the time, was not taking somebody out to a public square and throwing stones at him until he died. But it was taking him to a mountain, throwing him down off the cliff. When he hit the bottom, he died. Then they would take stones and pile them on top of the dead body. That's stoning. That's death by stoning. Okay. So this precipice, this mountain of precipice, is certainly a high cliff, a suitable place for carrying out an execution like that. But it's a ways away from the old city of Nazareth. So some have said this is probably not the precipice referred to in the gospel account. Maybe it was some other hill. Whether it was or whether it wasn't, standing on the Brow of Nazareth certainly gives you a good idea of what such a stoning would have been like. Besides which, it's a wonderful place to view the Jezreel Valley from, and gives you this wonderful panoramic view, north and south and west. And so we'll get a chance to see that. Number 11, today Nazareth is the home of more than 60,000 Israeli Arabs, and Upper Nazareth is home to thousands more Jewish residents. Okay, there's an Upper Nazareth and a Lower Nazareth. Lower Nazareth is primarily an Arab city. Upper Nazareth is a Jewish city. There are Israeli Arabs, that is, Arabs who live in Israel proper and have Israeli citizenship. Okay, Nazareth is not part of the so-called West Bank. Nazareth is in traditional Israel. Okay, is in modern Israel. But it's an Arab city. But there are Arabs who have Israeli citizenship. And many of them serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. Serving in the Israeli Defense Forces, they are not forced to fight against Arab nations when Israel goes to war against them. They're given exemption from that. Because the country of Israel does not force them to fight against their Arab brothers. But they still have ways of serving in the Israeli Defense Forces as citizens of Israel. Okay, 11a. The majority of Nazarenes are Palestinian Arabs. About 35 to 40% are Christians. The rest are Muslims. The Israeli government built a new city since the 1950s called Nazrat Illit. Nazrat is Nazareth in Hebrew. Illit means upper. Nazrat Illit, Upper Nazareth. And populated it with a Jewish majority. Home to many churches. There's the Church of the Annunciation, and built by the Byzantines, rebuilt by the Crusaders. Present church was built in 1955, and then again in 1969 it was expanded, so forth. It is now the largest church in the Middle East, Church of the Annunciation there in Nazareth. And then you have reference to a whole bunch of other churches there. So look up Jesus the Youth, Chapel of Our Lady of the Fright, Mary's Well, St. Gabriel's Church of the Annunciation. All these different places have been identified traditionally as holy sites, and this church is built over them.
They have a final synagogue there? No, yes? Nazareth?
There is I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head. I can't answer your question about the synagogue in Nazareth. It's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that. I haven't seen it, if it's there. Okay, so we mentioned that Nazareth then sits up on this hill overlooking the Jezreel Valley. Jezreel Valley looks across, you go across that to the west, and on the other side there's another hill. You actually look at Mount Carmel, and on the lower portion of Mount Carmel is another tell, a mound, and that mound is Megiddo. And we have to talk about Megiddo next. And in order to do that, I want to talk about where is Armageddon located in the Middle East, and why is Armageddon so important? We talk about the Battle of Armageddon. The Battle of Armageddon, referred to in the book of Revelation, is so well known that newspapers call their largest headline the Armageddon type. Okay? It's the headline that's used for the biggest disasters that anybody can dream of. They call it the Armageddon type, and they use it for these huge headlines. The Battle of Armageddon. Okay, you think about the Fertile Crescent we talked about. Okay, here is Mesopotamia. Here, see the Tigris River and the Euphrates rivers. Between the rivers, that's what Mesopotamia means. Modern day Iraq. So coming up around here in this green area, then down along where you have the Jordan River, more water, and then the Nile River. So this gives us the Fertile Crescent. Now, in the Old Testament, Abraham was called out of what city? Ur of the Chaldeans, right here, at the lower end of the Fertile Crescent, far in the east. Modern day Iraq, below Babylon, below Baghdad, which is up over in here, way down here, closer to the Arabian Gulf. Okay, so you have Ur of the Chaldeans. As Abram leaves Ur, he travels north to Haran, and he stops there for a while. After the death of his father, he then leaves Haran and comes down into the Holy Land, and then eventually from there down into Egypt and back. So Abraham traverses the entire Fertile Crescent. what you see here is the travel of Abram, or Abraham. This stop in Haran was kind of a detour. You see this roadway across here. This was the main travel route. So if you're going from Mesopotamia, the main travel route would take you up across here and then down, joining up with the Via Maris, and then down into Egypt. Okay, so Mesopotamia, major area of civilization. Egypt, major area of civilization. Lots of trade going across this travel route between Mesopotamia and Egypt. You also have, coming from North Africa, spice trade and other kinds of goods. And that would come through Egypt, then up again this Via Maris, and going into Mesopotamia this way. So lots of trade traffic. Then you would have, coming off of the Red Sea from the east coast of Africa, where there was mining, there was gold, there was silver, there were other spices, others coming up this route, joining into this major trade route. And then fourthly, coming down from Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, more traders coming down this route. Where do all these trade routes meet? They all form an X right here at Megiddo, the Valley of Jezreel, where you have this squeezing between the mountains of Samaria, the mountains of Galilee, Mount Carmel, by this narrow pass looked over by Megiddo. And thus the strategic importance of Megiddo and what we call Armageddon. This is what Megiddo looks like today. It is a tell. This is the round shape of the tell, the sloping sides. See the excavations here? Lots of ancient buildings here. You can see places like here where it's been cut away, cut into the stack of pancakes, as it were, so that you can see down multiple layers of civilization. Another cut over here off to the right-hand side, cutting down through. Other places, the top has simply been taken down, finding different levels. Here's an area here that's up higher than the area down here. Another area down here that's down lower. Another part of the city at another level of civilization. So this Megiddo, because of its strategic importance, has been settled at many different eras. Take a look at your notes on page 27, Roman numeral 18, Megiddo, located on the lower southeast slope of Mount Carmel. So Mount Carmel comes in from the sea, southeast end of it. This is really kind of an extension off the end of Mount Carmel is what it is. Overlooking the Jezreel Valley. Well, we were just in Nazareth overlooking the Jezreel Valley. Now we're on the other side of the valley, on the west side of the valley. The Tel, look at this, number 2. If you thought that Tel Hatzor had a lot of civilizations, look at Tel Megiddo, has approximately 30 strata of civilizations. So it's one of the most extensively excavated sites in all of Israel. And there is a water tunnel. The water tunnel at Megiddo is 210 feet long. Okay, at Hatzor it was, 80 some odd feet. Now 210 feet long. It is mentioned in the Egyptian records in the campaigns of Tutmosis III, Amenhotep II, and in the Amarna letters. So the ancient Egyptians knew about and wrote about Megiddo because the pharaohs were in control of this trade route. Okay, so Tutmosis III, Amenhotep II, and the Amarna letters. Biblical references. Okay, the king of Megiddo, this will be a Canaanite king, was put to death by Joshua, according to Joshua chapter 12, verse 21. So when Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land, this whole area, of course, was ruled by Canaanites. Joshua puts the Canaanite king to death. It was given to the tribe of Manasseh. So Manasseh was given the responsibility of conquering this. It's going to come out of the control of Manasseh, but Manasseh was supposed to have conquered it and kept it. Well, Manasseh was somewhat successful in getting some of the area around Megiddo, and as we said, the Canaanite king was put to death by Joshua, but point C, the Canaanites regained control in Joshua 17, verse 12, and we have reference to that again in Judges 127. So the Manassites were not able to keep control of it. It was involved in the defeat of Sisera, Judges 5:19. It was in the 5th Solomonic district. What does that mean? Well, King Solomon had the widest extent of the kingdom of Israel ever, and he had an extensive administration. So he had his kingdom divided up into these administrative districts, and they're described for us here in 1 Kings chapter 4. This was the 5th district of Solomon. It was one of 3 fortified chariot cities of Solomon, and as we said, there were more like 6 or 7 such chariot cities, but 3 major ones. One was at Hatzor, another one here at Megiddo. 1 Kings 9:15. Ahaziah died in the valley after being smitten by Jehu. Josiah was killed there, godly King Josiah. And it is associated with the final apocalyptic battle. Revelation chapter 16 talks about the kings of the earth, all the kings of the earth gathering for battle in the valley of Armageddon. Now, let's talk about Armageddon. What does that mean? Well, we have this place. We know the name of this place is Megiddo. In Hebrew, the word for a mountain or a hill is Har, H-A-R. So Har Megiddo. Har Megiddo becomes, in the book of Revelation, Armageddon. You do not pronounce the H in Greek. The book of Revelation is written in Greek. So they take the Hebrew Har Megiddo. In Greek it becomes Armageddon. Armageddon. There are a lot of place names in Hebrew that end with O-N, on. So we get the O-N ending. Armageddon. It's the mountain of Megiddo. That's the most likely derivation of the name Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo. There was an interesting theory put forth by another scholar a number of years ago that is an alternate possibility for Armageddon. Har still meaning mountain, but Megiddo or Megaddon might come from the Hebrew word moed. Moed, the pause in the middle of O, moed, after the O, before the aid, that little pause is actually a Hebrew letter called ayin, which oftentimes gets transliterated into Greek with the letter G. So moed would become moged, moged, and again O-N is a place name. Mogeddon is a lot like Megaddon, Armageddon. So the Armageddon possibly refers to the mountain of the assembly, which is what Moed means. The assembly being a name for the temple. So Armageddon has an alternate meaning. It could possibly mean the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Well, this fits the prophecy of Zechariah, who says all the kings of the earth will gather together against Jerusalem. So is the valley of Armageddon the valley here by Megiddo, the Jezreel Valley, or is it the valley just outside of Jerusalem? Good question. But most scholars favor Har Megiddo, okay, in the Jezreel Valley. the view that it might be the mountain of the congregation is a very, very minority view. But I know at least one important scholar who believes that and wrote an article in a peer-reviewed journal. Probably Armageddon is here. And Megiddo is just this incredible city, amazing city, chariot city of Solomon's with excavations going back to Canaanite and even pre-Canaanite times. Let's take a look at this here. Here is now a Canaanite altar that's been excavated. And to get an idea of the size of this is a person lying down in the middle of this altar. Now that thing's huge for an altar. And you see the steps leading up to the altar. The Jews were not to have steps leading up to their altars. They would have a ramp, okay, according to the law of Moses, a slope. But here are steps because it's a Canaanite altar. At the end of the water tunnel, over 200 feet long, it goes down not to the water table, but to a spring. And there's a spring in the side of the mountain of Megiddo. And there's a little bit of water in it here. When it rains a lot, there's more water that comes up in it. But this particular year, there wasn't a whole lot of water, but you can see some there. Here's the water tunnel, the horizontal section of it. You go a long ways down this tunnel, but carved out of solid stone. Okay. And then the vertical portion of it, these stairs are, of course, not original. These are cement stairs with handrails on it. But down, 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 until you get down. There's also here at Megiddo, probably from Solomon's time, a huge grain silo. And what you're looking at here is just one part of it. It's a big circular pit lined, and these look like stairs, and they act like stairs. There's another stairway opposite, 180 degrees opposite this, and probably what happened was a board was laid across those so that you could go down the stairs until you got to the level of the grain. You can walk out on the board and you could dip your bucket down and scoop grain out. Then you go back out to the stairs and go up. At least they think that's how it operated. When it was still being used, the sides were probably covered with plaster, so that it would have been smooth. But that plaster is all gone now. View looking down into the huge grain silo, which was found on the south side of Megiddo. It's been dated to the days of the powerful Israelite King Jeroboam. Notice the staircase that leads down, descending from the upper left to the lower right. Okay, so right down through here. There's a similar staircase on the opposite side of the silo. Evidently workers would descend one side, ascend the other. So come down, go out the board, fill up your bucket, go to the other side, go back up. That way you don't have traffic trying to go two ways down those narrow staircases. The silo is 36 feet in diameter and 23 feet deep. It has been calculated that it could hold 588 cubic yards of grain, enough to feed 300 to 350 horses for 130 to 150 days. So if indeed this was one of Solomon's chariot cities, we would expect there to be massive stores of grain. And that's exactly what we find there. We also, by the way, find stone mangers for the feeding of horses. And the manger in which Jesus was born in Bethlehem was probably like these, a stone manger, not a wooden manger like you see in all the nativity scenes at Christmas time. Okay, so there's some more of that Christmas card theology that we talk about. This was discovered at Megiddo, in the bottom of that grain silo, by the way. The seal of Jeroboam II. Okay, this was not the first Jeroboam right after Solomon, but the second Jeroboam, king of Israel. And this was his seal. It was discovered there. It is the earliest such seal ever discovered. And it's a good thing we've got a picture of it, because the seal has disappeared from sight. Yeah, nobody knows where it is today. But this was discovered in recent times, and it's a good thing we've got lots of good photographs of it. Okay. Beit Shean. Bet Shean is a marvelous city. It's incredible. You will love Bet Shean. The first time I visited Israel in the 1980s, everything you're looking at here, all this part down here where these buildings are, was all underground. This has all been excavated since the 1980s. And today it's a massive city, a Greek city from the 1st century. This is the city that was in existence at the time of Christ. And today we can walk through there and we can view all there is to see. You'll see right down here in the bottom right-hand side a massive amphitheater in full construction. Huge, even bigger than the one at Caesarea Maritima. Here's the Cardo Maximo, the main street running down the middle of the town. There are buildings over here. The public bath was over in this region. There are shops up in here and lots of houses. Now up on this hill here, on the far side of Bet Shean, is the ancient city. This is the Acropolis, going back to Canaanite and even pre-Canaanite times when the ancient Egyptians ruled the area. An Egyptian governor's palace has been excavated up here on the top. Now, what is the biblical significance of Bet Shean? Well, when King Saul and his son Jonathan, thank you, were put to death on the mountain Mount Gilboa, their bodies were taken to Bet Shean and hung on the wall as a disgrace to Israel. And then valiant men from across the Jordan River over in Bashan came and took their bodies down off the wall and buried them, gave them a decent burial under an oak tree. But this is the primary biblical significance of Bet Shean. We don't read about Bet Shean really in the New Testament at all, but it's almost certain that in his travels from Galilee down to Judea, Jesus would have passed through this city. It was on the main travel route. And so as we travel the Cardo Maximo through here, we can just imagine that Jesus would have walked down through this same walkway. Here are some sheep grazing outside of Bet Shean. Notice in your books, number 1, situated at the important junction of the Valley of Jezreel with the Jordan Valley, about 15 miles to the south of the Sea of Galilee. So you're headed south from Galilee down to Judea. You're probably going to go through Bet Shean. It goes, by the way, by the other name of Scythopolis. That's its Greek name. The fertility of the land and the abundance of water led the Jewish sages to say, if the Garden of Eden is in the land of Israel, then its gate is Bet Shean. Okay, that's how highly they thought of Bet Shean. Kind of poetic. The 80-meter high tell reveals 19 strata of civilization. Okay, we looked at that Acropolis where the Egyptian governor's palace is. That's the tell we're talking about. Okay, so that reveals 19 strata of civilization. It has been almost continuously settled since the 4th millennium BC, pre-Bronze Age, up to the modern times. And then, by the way, just to the right of the picture that we were looking at is the modern city of Bet Shean. It's just a modern city. They got a McDonald's and everything. So, in the 15th century BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III made it an administrative center for the control of the region. Page 29, 12th century BC, it became a Canaanite city. Biblical references, okay, given to the tribe of Manasseh. It was not taken by Joshua, but was retained by the Canaanites. Later, it was taken by the Philistines, 1 Samuel 31:7. One of the furthest north we read of the Philistines. For the most part, the Philistines are further to the south. But this is about as far north as we ever read of the Philistines going. Saul's body was fastened to the walls of Bet Shean. We just talked about that. In later times, intertestamental period, point number 8, 143 BC, Jonathan Maccabee tried to halt the Syrians and agreed to negotiations, only to be tricked and captured. In 106, the city was taken by the sons of John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus, one of the descendants of the Maccabees, some of the Hasmonean rulers. So it was taken by these Hasmoneans, and the inhabitants were given the choice to convert to Judaism or leave. The majority chose to leave, and the city became Jewish again. Okay, so this is this is about 100 years before Christ. 64 BC, it became the only city of the 10 cities of the Decapolis to be situated west of the Jordan River, and it was renamed Scythopolis. Okay, so we've had several mentions of the Decapolis. Deca, 10, polis, city. 10 cities that were Greek in culture, nine of them on the east side of the Jordan River. This is the one city of the Decapolis that's on the west side of the Jordan River. AD 66. In the first Jewish revolt, Vespasian made the city the winter camp for the 5th and 10th Roman legions. Okay, so again, earlier tonight we already referred to these two revolts. First revolt's in the 1st century, ends with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Second revolt is going to be under Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century. So now we're talking about the first Jewish revolt, and Emperor Vespasian camps out here. Many of the Jews of Scythopolis sided with the Romans against the Jewish revolt. Does that surprise you? Okay. But they wanted to save their own neck, I suppose. Later, 13,000 Jews of Scythopolis were slaughtered by the Greek residents of the city. Number 12, Jews lived in Bet Shean after the destruction of Jerusalem. 13th, the city grew and prospered under the Byzantines and was made the capital of Palestina Secunda. 14th, it declined with the Arab conquest, which made Tiberias its capital. Somebody tell me where Tiberias is located. Sea of Galilee. That's why the Sea of Galilee is also known as the Lake of Tiberias. Okay. So under the Arabs then, they focused more on Tiberias, and attention was taken away then from Bet Shean. Bet Shean did, however, become a center of wine production in spite of the Muslim prohibition. 749 AD, the city was destroyed by an earthquake. Later, rebuilt by the Crusaders. So Crusaders, approximately 1000 AD. 1322, a small Jewish community living in Bet Shean produced the first Hebrew book on the geography of Israel. That's a milestone. That's interesting. Okay, written in Hebrew by Jews way back in 1322. In the 19th century, okay, 19th century, 1800s, right? 19th century, it became a small village of about 200 people. Okay, population statistics during the Roman period, okay, that would include the time of the Lord, 1st century. Big city, 15 to 20,000 people. Later in the Byzantine period, even bigger, 30,000 to 40,000 people. Now, jump way across the Middle Ages to the time of that British conquest at the close of World War I, 1918. There were 1,710 Muslims there, 250 Christians, and 40 Jews, immigrants from Kurdistan and other Arab countries. And what about today? Today, there are 15,000 people living in Bet Shean. So it's got an interesting history. Here's a picture of some of the Roman pillars at Bet Shean along the Cardo Maxima. And that's it for Bet Shean. Now, we need to talk a little bit about Jerusalem. There's a lot, I mean, so much to say. We're not going to cover everything, but I want to give you some of the basic ideas here. First of all, the geography of Jerusalem. You need to get this down, or else, well, if you get this down, it'll make it easier to navigate your way around Jerusalem and figure out where you are. The geography of Jerusalem can be described in terms of 3 valleys and 2 hills. Okay? So we're looking at a topographic map here. And this is the old city of Jerusalem. The part that's in pink and the part that's surrounded by green depends on what you mean by the old city. But at the heart of it all is Temple Mount, right here. Okay? Here's where the temple stood in Old Testament times. Now, 3 valleys, 2 hills. Number 1, the Kidron Valley, marked here. This is on the east side of Jerusalem. Number 2, the Tyropoeon Valley. Now notice, between these 2 valleys you have a hump. Sitting up on this hump is what? Temple Mount. So the Kidron Valley on the east, Tyropoeon Valley on the west surround the Temple Mount. And this is old Jerusalem. The Jerusalem of King David was on this lower slope of this mountain. Solomon will push further north and build the temple up here. So this mountain right here is Jerusalem of the Old Testament, of the time of David and Solomon, surrounded by the Kidron Valley and the Tyropoeon Valley. But we said there are 2 mountains and there are 3 valleys. So what's the next valley? Right here. The Valley of Hinnom, sometimes called the Valley of Ben Hinnom. Ben means son, the son of Hinnom. The word for valley in Hebrew is Ge. Ge Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, Ge Hinnom, becomes Gehenna. Gehenna, which in the time of Christ, in the 1st century, was a name for hell. There were abominable things that took place in the Valley of Hinnom. In Old Testament times, Canaanites worshipped their deities down in the Valley of Hinnom and offered human sacrifices to the god Molech. And so infants were placed in the arms of Molech, a fire was built, and the babies were burned to death in human sacrifice. And so Gehenna, the place of burning, is a reference to hell. Later on, we're not exactly sure when, it may have been post-biblical times, this also was used as a garbage dump. And it was a place where there was garbage that was heaped, there were rotting corpses, and there were maggots and worms. Jesus refers to Gehenna as a place where the worm dieth not. So it may have already been used for this in biblical times. Right down here at the south end, south of the temple, there was a gate of the city called the Dung Gate. Because you go out, you haul the dung from the city out this gate and dump it in the Valley of Hinnom. It was the garbage dump. Okay? So it's somewhat ironic, but when we visit the Temple Mount, when we go to the holiest place, we enter through the Dung Gate. Okay? But that's because it's the way down here to the Valley of Hinnom. So, 3 valleys. You can think of Jerusalem like this. Okay? Just hold up 3 fingers. You've got the Kidron Valley, the Tyropoeon Valley, and then the Hinnom Valley curving around like this from your thumb. Okay? So Temple Mount, and then the second mountain. This second mountain here, surrounded by Tyropoeon and Hinnom, is known as the Western Hill. The Western Hill. Now, one of the questions on the review sheet says, discuss the location of Mount Zion at various stages of Jerusalem's history. Since we're talking about mountains, let's talk about the names of these mountains. In the Bible, the temple is said to be on Mount Zion. Okay, so this must be Mount Zion. But before the temple was built, David built his palace on Mount Zion. Where is that? That's down here. Abraham, going back way earlier than David, was told to bring his son Isaac and offer him in sacrifice on the mountains of Moriah. That is traditionally held to be the same as Temple Mount. So, it appears that what we have first is Zion is here. North of Zion up here is Moriah. But then later, the name Zion comes to refer to the whole thing. But here's a curious thing. You visit Israel today, and you're looking for Mount Zion because you want to go see the temple. And so you ask a local resident of Jerusalem, maybe a policeman or something, can you direct me to Mount Zion? Or you get in a taxi cab and you say, would you please take me to Mount Zion? They will direct you here. Because this is referred to as Mount Zion today. We don't know exactly when this started, but we can trace it at least as far back as the Crusaders. So once again, what you have is Crusaders arriving in the Holy Land, wanting to find these holy places. They don't have a road map that tells them where to find Mount Zion, so they ask the local Arab, can you please direct me to Mount Zion? He says, sure, for 5 shekels I'll show you right where it is. He has no idea where Mount Zion is, so he says, here's Mount Zion. And so the Crusaders build a church right down in this corner of this green wall here. And it is a very famous church, which probably goes back even to the 1st century, certainly to Byzantine times, and we think even to New Testament times, that is said nowadays to be on Mount Zion. So Mount Zion refers to the southern hill, then it refers to the northern hill, and then it later referred to the western hill, and today this is called Mount Zion. Tom Meyer, one of our professors, attended the Jerusalem University College, which is on Mount Zion. It's right down here, right outside the city walls, right overlooking the Valley of Hinnom, right here. Okay, and it's a great place to go and study, but it's not the biblical Jerusalem of King David's day. Of King David's day, the old city of Jerusalem was here on this southeastern hill. Do you see the white line going around it? That was the city wall in David's day. So when David wanted to take the city, the inhabitants were Jebusites. The Jebusites were one of the Canaanite tribes, and they held the city, and it was a fortified city. It had a massive wall around it. This was the old wall of the city of Jerusalem. It was called Jebus at that time. So another question here asks, somewhere on here, about the names of the old city of Jerusalem. I think it's one of our questions.
18.
Which one?
18.
18. How old are the old city walls? Okay, that's the old city walls. I thought I asked a question about the names, but maybe I didn't. But let me just tell you. Okay, if you go back to Abraham, the first time we encounter this city is when Abraham meets Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the king of this city, and what's it called? Salem. Salem. Later it will be called Jerusalem. Jerusalem. But Salem was the early pre-Canaanite name. It was called that when Melchizedek was king. Later, the Israelites enter into the Holy Land under Joshua, and this city now is under the control of a Canaanite tribe, Jebusites, and they have named it after themselves. It is called Jebus. David conquers Jebus and he renames it Jerusalem, after the ancient name in Melchizedek's day, Jerusalem, or Yerushalayim. Salem coming from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace, and Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, the city of peace. This is the city right here. So the old city walls in David's day were down here. This comes from Canaanite times. In Solomon's day, he has to extend the walls further north to surround the temple. So in Solomon's time, the walls encompass this temple. Later on, and this, we don't know exactly when, by Hezekiah's time, certainly, we have extended the city of Jerusalem out here onto the western hill. And so you see this pink area and these white walls coming out here. Still all of ancient Jerusalem, but now coming out onto the western hill, extending up here north of the Temple Mount. Under Hezekiah, it is quite broad. Okay. And when the city of Jerusalem is rebuilt again, after the Babylonian captivity, it will take in all this area. Probably starting out small, but gradually growing, so that in the time of Christ, it's again like this pink area. So what is this green wall? This green wall here is what you see when you look at the old city walls today. The old city walls of Jerusalem today are from the Middle Ages. They are Ottoman. They're from the Ottoman Empire. They aren't biblical. The only part of it that's biblical is a little part here that includes the Temple Mount. So the old city walls of today include the Temple Mount, but David's city is entirely outside of what you see as the old city walls today. Okay? So there is an archaeological park down here in what is known as the City of David. And the archaeologist Eilat Mazar has been excavating here for a number of years and thinks she has discovered the palace of King David. Also down here, you have, going from the Gihon Spring, this water spot here, to the Pool of Siloam down here, you have an underground tunnel, which is Hezekiah's tunnel. When the Assyrians were invading from the north, Hezekiah was concerned because, as you can see, the Gihon Spring is outside of the city wall. If the water source for your city is outside of the city wall, you're in danger. The enemy can come and stop it up, or they can poison it. So what do? Well, you build a tunnel to bring the water into the city. So a pool is built here, but the problem is you've got a mountain in between. So what do? Well, the Assyrians are on their way. Tying this short, Hezekiah takes his diggers. He puts half of them at the Gihon Spring. He puts half of them at the Pool of Siloam. They start digging towards each other underground. Without modern equipment, they build a tunnel in an S shape, and miraculously, they meet halfway. And we will have a chance to go through that tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel. There's still water in it, still flows from Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam. It's about thigh deep, but you go through Hezekiah's tunnel, and you can look on the sides of the wall, see the pick marks that Hezekiah's men made as they were carving out that tunnel. Yeah, right there. I mean, we talked about a lot of sites, we don't know if they're authentic or not, but there are sites that are very authentic. And I mean, it doesn't get any more authentic than that, and it's a thrill. And you can even get at the halfway point, you can see at one point the pick marks are arcing this direction because they're swinging their picks in the limestone. At the halfway point, you see where the pick marks are going this direction, and they meet. And it's about halfway through.
Bring
Yeah,
a light.
it's amazing.
Bring a light.
Yeah, you need to bring a flashlight or a headlight or something, because there's no electricity, no lights in there. You have to have your own light, and you want to bring some clothes that you can wear, get wet, and change out of after we're done. We'll go to a place where you can change. But there are the city walls. You've got David's walls, then you've got Solomon's walls coming up here. You got Hezekiah's walls out here. You got the Ottoman walls, way different, totally different. And we'll see some of the excavations of ancient walls. In Jerusalem today have been excavated walls that come from the time of Nehemiah. And those are some of the very, very ancient walls. We can see a retaining wall right here on the edge of the Kidron Valley, just above the Gihon Spring, that goes back to Jebusite times. So it's quite amazing. So here is then the original Mount Zion, no longer called Mount Zion today. Here is the western hill, today called Mount Zion. 2 hills, 3 valleys. That's Jerusalem. But there's another hill that we read about in Scripture, Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives. This is a favorite place for the Lord Jesus to meet with his disciples when he's in Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives was never a part of Jerusalem in biblical times. It always lay outside of the city limits of Jerusalem. So the Kidron Valley was the boundary between Jerusalem and then outside of Jerusalem. The Kidron Valley is a very important valley. Jesus crosses the Kidron Valley with his disciples after he initiates the Lord's Supper. King David, in an earlier day, will cross the Kidron Valley when he flees from before his son Absalom in Absalom's rebellion. And we'll talk about the significance of Kidron Valley when we're over there looking at it, and we'll get a good chance to look at it. Okay, so here is looking at, without the topography, here to the south is the city of Jebus. These are the Ottoman walls right here. Okay, so the old city of Jerusalem, entirely outside of the old city walls. Okay, Jebus, also known as the city of David. Later, under Solomon, up until the time of Hezekiah, okay, Solomon goes to the north. Hezekiah pushes it out here to the west. So here's the old city of David here, Jebus. Up here, across this region known as the Ophel, and up onto the Temple Mount. And then starting to push westward. As rebuilt by Nehemiah, almost the same as in Hezekiah's day, but a little skinnier in Nehemiah's time. In the New Testament, these dark walls at the time of Herod the Great, which would include also the time of Jesus. Okay, and then these white walls here, these are the Ottoman walls. So quite different. Today, the old city of Jerusalem is divided into 4 quarters. You've got the Muslim quarter, you've got the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. Notice where the Temple Mount is. In the Muslim quarter? Yep, they've claimed it. And instead of a temple, a mosque. 2 mosques, in fact. The Dome of the Rock, which is more famous to most people today. But down here on the southern end, Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the more important mosque for the Muslims. This is where they actually worship. They don't really worship in the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is a memorial to Muhammad, because they believe that from the Dome of the Rock, Muhammad ascended into heaven on his steed. And so it is a memorial. But it is much more important as, very likely, the site of the temple.
Were they considering letting tourists in?
Say again?
Were they considering letting people into the dome?
No, not that I know of. We used to be able to go inside the Dome of the Rock when I first visited Israel. Yeah, I've been in there, I've seen the rock, and it's interesting. and you can go down under the rock. I've been down there, but now they won't let you in anymore. They used to let us in Al-Aqsa Mosque also, but you can't go in Al-Aqsa Mosque anymore either. In the Christian quarter up here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional site of the crucifixion and burial of Christ. There's an alternate site where Christ may have been crucified and buried up here. We are told that Christ was crucified outside the city walls. But you've just seen how difficult it is to define exactly where the city walls are. Because the city walls today were not the city walls in Jesus' time. So where exactly did the old city walls run in Jesus' time relative to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? And there's a difference of opinion. And we haven't been able to excavate clearly enough to tell exactly whether the Church of the Holy Sepulchre lay inside or outside of the old city walls in biblical time. So those are some of the problems. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes. I think we have just about enough time to finish up with this, this video I wanted to show you about the legal right of Israel to the land. And just in preparation for that, let me just go through these next couple of maps that look at the nation of Israel. Now, in 1947, this was the UN partition plan. It took this whole region here, which prior to 1947, if you go back to 1920, the entire thing was to be a homeland for the Jews under the British mandate. The United Nations took the British mandates home for the Jews and divided it up between Jews and Arabs. Under the British mandate, the Arabs' home was to be over here in Transjordan. Transjordan was for the Arabs, Palestine for the Jews. But the United Nations decided to divide it up along this so that the orange areas would be for the Jews, the yellow areas would be given to the Arabs, and right in the middle, Jerusalem was to be an international city, neither Jewish nor Arab, but governed by the United Nations. Okay, that was the plan in 1947. Passed in 1948. The Arabs immediately declared war against Israel and tried to push Israel into the sea. Now, back up to 1920, Palestine under the British mandate, the entire thing was to be given to the Jews. In 1920, there were significant Jewish settlements in each of these orange areas. Okay, so there were, this idea that the Jews didn't come until 1948 is false. There have always been Jews. There were lots of Jews, big Jewish settlements all through here. Okay. We won't take the time to look at this, but this is in 1948, the movements of the Arabs against Israel in the war for Israel's independence. Between 1948 and 1967, then, the armistice lines, they were not borders, they were armistice lines. These were ceasefire lines between Israel and the Arab neighbors, were right here. And you see pretty much the shape of Israel. This West Bank was held by Jordan. The Gaza Strip was held by Egypt, but Israel had gained the entirety of this part between 1948 and 1967. In 1967, there was a second war between the Arabs and Israel, and the Arabs once again said, we're going to push those Jews into the sea. And at the end of the 67 war, Israel had conquered the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, all of the Sinai Peninsula, all the way up to the Suez Canal, and the Golan Heights up here that they did not hold prior to 1967. And they did all that in 6 days. Okay, known as the 6 Days War. And then in a peace agreement, first with Egypt, The Sinai Peninsula was given back to Egypt in exchange for peace, and the West Bank was given to the Palestinians in order to gain peace with the country of Jordan. Okay, Israel's boundaries, ceasefire lines in 1993, then here. And let me just, before we watch this video, it's not a real long video, but let me just talk about the gates of the old city of Jerusalem today. These are the gates of the Ottomans, but these are the old city walls today. Here's the Temple Mount, and you've got this, it's divided into 4 parts. We have these gates, the Golden Gate, which is closed up, also known as the Eastern Gate, right outside the Temple Mount. North of that, you have the Lion's Gate. Okay, on this map, by the way, north, see here, north is directed on this side. The Lion Gate. Okay, that's still a gate that you can enter. The lions are actually leopards, not lions, but it was named Lion Gate. The leopard was the animal that Saladin went by to show his fierce ferocity. Then around on this side, we have Herod's Gate on the north side. Also on the north side, the Damascus Gate, because you go north out of Jerusalem to take the road to Damascus. You also go through the Damascus Gate to take the road up to our hotel. Okay, so the Ambassador Hotel, where we'll be staying, is just across the Damascus Gate, straight up the street, and you can walk to our hotel, or vice versa. So on our free day in Jerusalem, you'll probably walk down from the hotel to the old city and go through the Damascus Gate. The new gate is over here on this corner, the Jaffa Gate, because you're on the west side now. If you want to go to Jaffa, where? On the Mediterranean coast, you go out the west side, the Jaffa Gate, and down the road to Jaffa, right by Tel Aviv. Here, the Zion Gate. Why? Because this is modern Mount Zion, right? The Western Hill. Not biblical Zion, but modern Zion. So there's a gate here called the Zion Gate, and the Zion Gate is right close to Jerusalem University College. And we talked about the Dung Gate, right here on the south side on your way up to the Temple Mount.